1792, Mary Wollstonecraft wrote A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, a completely pioneering work that demanded, in its opening lines, justice for one half of the human race. Exactly 2 centuries later, somebody sitting not too far away wrote, Eve was framed. And it's a very no-punches-pulled look at what she calls the gentleman's club, and focuses deeply on the prejudices of judges, the misconceptions of jurors, and the labyrinths of courts, and how it's all set against women. Scroll forward another 25 years, and there's more. Eve was shamed, again, by Dame Helena Kennedy. But where's the progress? Where's the progress in this? Some things obviously have changed. Some things have stayed the same, and some have got worse. And that's what we're here to discuss with this very distinguished panel. I have, of course, here Dame Helena Kennedy, the author of these books, available in all good bookshops. Dame Helena Kennedy QC, and she is undoubtedly the nation's best loved and most uncompromising troublemaker. A lawmaker of many years, a long-term champion of reform for laws around women, especially relating to domestic and sexual violence. She developed the Defence of Battered Women's Syndrome in the British courts. She's a member of the House of Lords for over 20 years. She's the Chair of Justice for the British arm of the International Commission of Jurists. The woman does not sit around. Then we have the very distinguished lawyer and Professor Avi Singh from New Delhi, and he joins us with his specialisation in criminal and transnational law. He also writes about questions of law and policy and has advised the Delhi Dialogue Commission on gender equality. And then the fabulous Dr. Sunita Toor, who joins us from the Sheffield Hallam University, where she's principal lecturer in criminology. And she's leading a very interesting project called Justice for Her, based at the Helena Kennedy Centre for International Justice. And it's doing very exciting work in India, which we'll be hearing about soon. But first, Helena, I have to come to you. The first book really, didn't take any prisoners. Why did you have to write another one?
Because a lot had happened, but not enough had changed. And I've got to remind people, and some are visitors coming here just now from India, and many people from the diaspora living here in Britain, and many Brits too. And I just wanted to say that, one of the things that has happened is that we keep having scandals. We keep having those moments where we think, is this the turning point? Is this going to mean that it's, and we had it, around the whole business of Jimmy Savile, the whole thing about historic child abuse, institutions like the Catholic Church, but also other churches, the Anglican Church and so on. All these scandals which were about historic abuse. And I kept being asked, how could it have happened? Didn't people know? And the real problem about all of this was about the silencing around abuse, and about the nature of shame and how that operates in our society, and how people were made to feel ashamed, made to feel that somehow they were responsible for what had happened to them. But then, of course, 2 years ago, I updated Eve Was Framed, the original book written 27 years ago. I updated it in 2004, and it was really statistically looking at it, and it wasn't a major reviving. It was just looking at it, looking at how it shifted, how we had managed to get many more women into the legal profession, because our law schools are full of women, as Sunita will tell you, and it's the same, I'm sure, in India. And the interesting thing is that although we've got many more women coming into the law, more women slowly but surely getting up into the judiciary, we haven't seen the real change. Although we have reformed a bit of law here and a bit of law there, what is it that keeps the statistics so appalling? That,
what kind of statistics do you mean?
Well, the conviction rate in rape is not actually, in the last few years, has gone down in this country. 1 in 7 women, statistically, we know that 1 in 7 women, are raped, and that's being done with a sort of really widespread piece of research across Britain. That the police receive 1 phone call a minute about domestic violence. 2 women a week are killed in the UK, and that's in this small, set of nations. 2 women a week killed. And so by a partner and a spouse. I mean, we're not talking about, the stalking and the serial killers who kill women. We're talking about inside their own homes. And so we still have this serious set of problems and a failure of law to deal with it. And the real thing for me was that when the Me Too movement happened, and suddenly, women were talking about this and had found a vehicle, the internet, to exchange their stories and also to name and shame, it raised very serious issues for the law. For me, it was about, women. It's about mass civil disobedience. Let's be very clear. This is mass civil disobedience. The law is involved in a social contract with the people of nations. And what the law is supposed to do is it says, bring your grievances to us. Don't deal with them yourselves. That creates anarchy and chaos and so on. It leads to horrible things of, wild justice. We take them to the state and we deal with it. And we, through an independent judiciary, the rule of law and all of that, we deal with the wrongs that happen to you.
Clearly, in India, the instance of Me Too showed that this just wasn't happening.
And it's not happening. And it's not happening, I'm afraid, in most countries actually around the world, is that because law is, was created without women's experience being at the heart of it, then of course there are so many ways in which it fails women. And those who are the if you like, the administrators, the police, the prosecutors, so many of the decision makers in all of this actually have never really addressed the unconscious biases, the way in which they still believe in the myths. They don't realize it, but they do. Myths about women being dishonest, about that women who are promiscuous, will absolutely sleep with any man, And I always sort of say a woman is entitled to sleep with the whole of the football team and say no to the goalie, and so. And people don't realise that. They think if you're a prostitute, then it doesn't matter if the hell is beaten out of you, you can't be raped.
Can I just stop you there though? Because one of the things I'd like to zoom in on, and one of the misconceptions, one of the areas that you focus on in Eve Was Shamed, is the idea around rape and how there are so many misconceptions about what it is and how it's treated in law. Do you think why is rape not like other crimes?
Well, part of course, is that so often it happens in situations of intimacy and therefore within the closed room. And so therefore it usually involves one person's word against another. But the way in which that is scrutinised...
But it's more than that, and you suggest...
And it's more than that, of course. It brings into it very deep-seated sort of profound feelings and the baggage, which is that while it's about power and it's about abuse and it's about and often real violence, although there doesn't have to be violence. Sometimes women are put in such fear that they end up being, letting this thing happen to them, and then that counts against them. But so often it is about an abuse of power. And I tell some of the stories though of some of the things that are happening now, which is that, and this is, I don't know whether this replicates itself in India, but certainly there's a sort of way in which a machismo is fed by the internet, and it's often groups. So you'll get sportsmen. We had the most hideous case in Northern Ireland recently of a group of really
rugby players,
and they were absolutely the pin-up boys of Ireland because they were great rugby players, and the behaviour towards a young woman who was a student, who was just finishing her degree, and she had gone out with a group of women friends, and then being invited back to the apartment of this for a party with these glamorous rugby players, and then she goes up to the loo and she's then pushed into a bedroom, and it's not just by one, but a whole crowd of them go in, and then they pile in on her. And she ended up leaving that room bleeding. And they were acquitted. And the public gallery was filled with 100 of their supporters, and every so often way would be made so that the celebrated other stars would come and sit in the front row, and the jury would see them coming in, and they were there to lend support to their fellow sportsmen. And these guys were acquitted. And I think of that young woman and I think of how is she living her life now? And she's had to be given a new identity. I mean, it's just hell.
I want to bring the process through which the victim travels to an earlier stage of that. Suni, your work involves training. So you've done a lot of training of male and female police officers in India. Why do they need your training?
We began training in India about 3 years ago, and for us it was about trying to change the discourse of how you engage police officers, not only in gender-based violence but also in the victim perspective. So what
how they view the victim.
Yeah, so but also giving them a level of empathy about this is what the victim would go through. So we started that process 3 years ago, and some of the stuff that we've done is really going, this is not about gender sensitisation, which is commonly the dialogue that you have in India, but this is about overhauling completely the types of training that police officers get.
You talk about empathy a lot. What does that mean?
For us in our training, it's about understanding that if somebody's coming to the police station, and in India a police station has a lot of daunting prospects to it, that you understand that that's quite a difficult journey, and if you are a victim of serious sexual assault as a woman in particular, that is even more daunting for that woman. So we do lots of things which we don't have time to talk about, but role play to visualizations to positioning types of activities where we get the police officer to be in the position of the victim and working them through that process from the first responder. So what does that look like for the victim? So what would it be like for her to go into a police station? What would she then encounter? Or even just pick up the phone, you know, if she's doing it from home.
And what have the obstacles been to your work?
We've been really fortunate in India that we've had a lot of really great buy-in by police officers. So senior leaders have supported us. They've liked that it's innovative. They've liked that it's different. So from that perspective, entry has been good. One of the key barriers that we found wasn't necessarily about talking about serious sexual assault, was about talking about domestic violence. It blew the mind of police officers to have a conversation about domestic violence and stuff that goes on inside the home, because they couldn't get their head around.
The private
slapping your wife is okay if she hasn't done this, or you know, we don't understand why a woman would go and complain about domestic violence. So that was the bit that we found really challenging in our training, was to have those sorts of conversations.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Avi, I want to bring you in here because I know that you've done a lot of work around culture and how culture and traditions and sort of deeply held family views sort of seep into our interpretation of the law.
Yeah, I mean, just the context of domestic violence. And of course, we've had a much greater reinforcement of the statutory law with regard to rape, which still needs a legal culture which supports the statutory changes, because the way the law works in India is very different, like in many other countries, from the way it is actually written down. But in domestic violence, in fact, there has been a carving out, even by the Supreme Court, that these cases are compromisable. They can be settled up because it's really in the realm of a private marital space.
That's the critical phase.
And that's the critical
it's
thing.
private. This isn't a matter.
And even when there has
debate.
been violence, I've struggled in cases, many cases, representing, in fact, the state, because I'm allowed to make, even when the state wants to compromise, I've taken an independent stance, but had opposition from judges and other prosecutors, and of course defense, etc., saying, why are you interfering in people's marital lives, even when there's been beatings, stabbings. There's a recent case going on, which is really horrific. It's an immigrant community, Afghan, where the two daughters have been sexually abused by the second husband, and you know, the court is hell-bent on, based on their statements and the statement of the mother saying, well, he is the provider, they want all to be a family unit, but of course this is not a safe environment for anyone. So even if the state takes a stance, there is a culture pervasive that it is still a private space where the state shouldn't come in. And the question then emerges, the question we keep asking the courts, and you know, it's very slow to move those legal cultures, because the law says these cases are not compromisable. The Supreme Court says, well, it's a private sphere. So the question then is, does the state have a duty to protect women, survivors, independent of them? And of course, I believe it does. But this issue, it really needs, you know, for people to rise and write about it and talk about it much more, because for me, domestic abuse really is the beginning of violence against women.
Yeah.
And I think just to continue that point, one of the interesting other ways in which you've made yourself annoying to certain people in the legal profession is that you've taken a stand against settling out of court, which is another way of keeping this in the
these
private
issues are all
domain.
settled out of court and then brought to court for a judicial stamp on
Yes.
that settlement. So I've consistently taken a stance that if there is any kind of violence, which is demonstrable with evidence, then the state should not, in fact. So in cases that I'm marked, I've got a very bad reputation that, you know, if it gets marked to him, you know, it's going to be very difficult to settle. But in most cases, you know, we found a lot of judicial resistance, even among women judges.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Right?
Why? Why?
Because of this culture of that it is a place that the state shouldn't go into, and deep-rooted patriarchal attitudes in the end of what is a marital space and what is a home.
But of course, we dealt with all of that here. I mean, when I was a young lawyer, that was precisely the position, was that, you know, an Englishman's home is his castle, and the police did not go in there and it's left with a warrant or whatever. And it has been a slow, hard process of actually eroding the notions that support that, and the responsibilities of the state to prevent crimes, and that, you know, there have to be points at which that is not the position. And so the protecting of women and children, because we knew that within the domestic environment, some of the most egregious crimes actually take place against the vulnerable. And so domestic violence was one of those areas, and we've had to work very hard at getting away from that way of thinking. And let's deal for a minute with the business of women. You know, even just now on the business of Me Too, you'll get lots of women, older women of my generation who will say, oh, it's all gone too far, and, you know, all you have to do is slap his hand, and, you know, if he tries to put his hand up your skirt.
Jeffrey Archer has said in the last session, oh, you can't flirt with anybody nowadays.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I'm telling you this, in the House of Lords, all these old guys come up to me and say, oh, you look so nice. Oh, am I not allowed to tell you? And I say, you know the difference, don't you pretend. You know. Anyway, but we know the difference, and they know the difference. You know, we're talking about invading women's, you know, the integrity of their space and all of that, and also being, you know, being abusive. And so that business of domestic violence remains here, still one that we have to deal with. And it is so important that women too have to address the fact that we absorb what our cultures teach us. It's part of the hegemony that, you know, we absorb these ideas. And as women, that's why so many women refuse to say that they're a feminist, you know, because people will think I don't like men, or people will think that I'm one of those horrible, you know. And and I always remember being refreshed when I met some women from the Supreme Court of Canada, and I must have been a sort of, you know, I was in my late 30s, and they sort of said, oh, and of course, because I'm a feminist, I do. And I thought, wow, a senior woman judge is calling herself a feminist. And, you know, we really have to get over this stuff. This is about also all of us addressing our own unconscious biases, and we've got to get over it. It's unacceptable to beat people. And I remember doing a case in which I went before the Court of Appeal, and it was a great moment. It was the Chief Justice Taylor, and Peter Taylor was the person who said, hitting is never acceptable. And the mere slap, it was just, you know, because there were people saying, but it was only a little bit of slapping her. It wasn't serious. You know, she didn't end up on the floor with black and blue. Slapping people, hitting people, you know, making people fearful is unacceptable. And in a modern relationship, in a marriage, or in any kind of intimacy, and there is no place for this. And we have to make that clear everywhere. And the court should be leading the way on it. And unfortunately, sometimes they don't.
In terms of representation, and Avi, I know you've done some work around this, the use of quotas in the legal profession is something that you've supported. What do you think it is that's stopping the uptake of this idea?
Well, obviously that we don't have enough women representation. You know, we have now about 1/3 of law students in India are women, but the percentage in litigation is much smaller.
And then all the way up
the percentage in criminal litigation is starkly smaller. We only have in high court judges, I don't have the statistics for the lower courts, about 11% of high court judges are women, and we have 3, so less than 10%, Supreme Court judges who are women currently, and the 3rd Supreme Court judge is a woman, is only the 6th in the history of the Supreme Court. So, you know, we
You're
have...
doing better than us.
Yeah.
I mean, we it's only been in the last year that we've added two more women to the one woman who was there. And it always reminded me when we brought in the Sex Discrimination Act, and sets of chambers that used to say, oh, we don't take women, we don't take women. And then the Sex Discrimination Act came in, and then they would say, women, we've got one. And
That's exactly it. I've heard that very often. We already have one Supreme Court judge as a woman.
And so we had one Supreme Court judge for 13 years.
Are any of you not in favour of quotas?
I'm in favour of quotas. I'm absolutely in favour of quotas.
I am, but I think with
It may be more difficult in some circumstances.
yeah, I mean in
We're ready for it now.
in the police in India there are quotas, but it's so varied across states where you've only got 2% of police officers that are women, to other states that are really focusing, like Madhya Pradesh, who I work with, are focusing on getting more, but they've only got 10%. And the experience of female police officers is problematic, you know, because they go into that arena and they experience huge discrimination and prejudice and harassment, and they leave. So the journey is not just about the quota of getting them in, but it's about what happens when they're in that institution and what is their experience. And that's where there's a real sort of gulf in
I just wondered, you've looked at quotas in Paris.
Yeah, so this is, I mean,
success
but also it goes further to the bar councils, which are, you know, deeply problematic in themselves. So the Paris bar, you have to run for every position in the Paris bar as a team of a man and a woman.
Oh, that's interesting.
Right, so every seat is actually a 2-person seat, so there is, you know, gender equality, which is institutionally built in. And those are the kind of things I think we do need
to look at.
You know, and to start with the bar councils, because we have, for example, the Bar Council came out very strongly in favor of the Chief Justice in a sexual harassment complaint by a worker recently, you know, questioning the woman's integrity, etc., which is no role of the Bar Council to be, you know, cozying up to the Chief Justice. But these are the kind of things we need to really look at it. And just to speak about, you know, so for example, the Delhi police has now started handing to the minority of investigating officers it does have sexual assault cases. And I worked with a lot of them, and they always complain, but that's all we get now.
Yeah.
Oh, you've experienced the same thing, haven't you? So it
We
feels
only
like a
get to do
niche rather
sexual,
than
yeah, we get
mainstream.
niched in to sexual assault cases because we've been assigned that.
Yeah.
Can I just mention something? I mean, one of the things that of course keeps women in abusive relationships, and even in relationships where they know, for example, that a partner or, you know, a second husband is abusing their children, and it happens particularly in that situation of abusing the children who are the children of a previous partner or husband, because somehow it feels as if that makes it okay. It's not. I'm not doing it to my own children. I'm doing it to somebody else's. But abuse of children, and women sort of permitting it or turning a blind eye to it because of this business of being so dependent financially on men. And so it's the one that goes back to the much more complex picture of trying to create societies in which women have greater financial independence, and even poor women being given the opportunity of having some financial independence. You know, and those things are the big picture in which law plays its part. But it also is that I feel very strongly that law has an important leadership role in this, in leading the way in which cultural norms are established. Laws end up giving a kind of permission for certain kinds of conduct. And so that's why it's for the legal world has to get its act together and really deal with some of this stuff. Because you know, you will get, I mean, just to go back to the Me Too thing, you will get allegations, of course, made unfairly against men for all kinds of other complicated reasons that somebody might make up an allegation. And you need processes to deal with that. And
The sense that came out of that, though, was that the system was just too slow. The machinery was just too slow.
And not just too
and
slow.
Social media is so quick. How on earth can the law compete?
Absolutely. And so, but there is something, I mean, about the risks associated with this. And the internet has now given an opportunity, and social media, an opportunity for women to use it as a tool with which to beat those who abuse them. But in amongst it, there will be unjust allegations. And as a lawyer committed to the rule of law, I don't like that. I want due process. I don't want people to suffer detriments, whether it's in their job or whatever, or punishment, if there's a possibility that they didn't do what's alleged against them. So we have to have that always in our minds, because you do create something very ugly if you turn away from those structures. But we have to get the structures right to win the confidence of women and those who are vulnerable generally.
Helena, your book explores the ways in which women are different. The crimes that women commit are different. The quote I picked out is, "Women rarely kill, yet they are frequently murdered." Should the law, therefore, treat everybody equally?
Oh, absolutely not. Because let me just tell you why. Because there's a distortion about what equality means. And I try in the book to explain that treating as equal those who are not equal certainly doesn't produce equality, and it does not produce justice. We have to be really conscious of that. This business of equality treating everybody the same. And I remember once a judge saying that to me when I was I became the sort of voice on these issues. I was doing a case, and he said, "You're the lawyer, Miss Kennedy, who's always making a noise about treating people with equality, and I'm going to treat your client with equality, and she's going to go to jail." And I had to say to him, "Yeah, but hold on a wee minute. My client is a mother of 3 children. She's a lone parent, and so the punishment that is going to be actually inflicted on her is of a disproportionate nature to that which might be on a single man. You have to see the circumstances of her life, the reality of her existence." And that's what real justice is about. And so we've got to open up this notion of what equality really means. And it's about treating people as equals, respecting them and their experience and putting it into the context. And justice is difficult. It's not easy.
So you responded physically to that. What did you want to add?
Well, one of the first, one line which, when I teach, I always tell people sort of, and it's in your book, which is that law is never neutral. Right?
It's not the iconic, the
it's
blind
never
ball
neutral.
figure.
It's never blind. And Justice Krishna Iyer was a great social jurist who was also in the Supreme Court, said this in the context of, somebody sleeping beneath a bridge is not equal to a man with a house, right? I mean, he was saying it in an economic, but certainly the law doesn't treat women in its practice equally, right? It doesn't punish anybody who is discriminating against women, even today in India. There is no prosecutorial body with powers which is actively protecting women's rights out there in Indian society, but in most societies. So the law doesn't treat many marginalized communities, but the largest of them happen to be women. And that's something which needs to be addressed by first doing away with this notion, which is why I love that the law is never neutral. So you need to make law a weapon for equality.
But you're both of you are much younger than I am. But when I was young and going through law school, we were taught that the law was neutral. I mean, that was the whole idea, was that the law is neutral. And
is that still taught, or has it shifted?
The idea of neutral law and that the language is neutral, and so it says, him at stroke her now in lots of legislation that goes through. But the reality is that you have to see this as a myth. It's a fiction. It's a useful fiction at times, but it's not the reality. Yes, we like to say the rule of law means that the rich and poor, that there's no impunity for the privileged, but we know that there is often impunity for the rich and the very privileged. If you go into the prisons, women's prisons everywhere, the women who are there almost invariably shouldn't be there. And they're there because of their poverty. They're there because of the hand that has been dealt them. And here in Britain, honestly, something like 68% of women in prison have got mental health problems, They've been abused as children. When you do serious research on this, abuse as children coming from homes in which violence is all that's to be expected, and then when they're abused by men, that's what they think is to be expected. And it's this cycle of abuse that then leads them into prostitution. It leads them into feeling unworthy and doing things for men like, looking after their drugs or, and all those things. And you see what women are in jail for, and they shouldn't be there. And in other parts of the world, when I visit prisons, I was in a prison in Iraq not that long ago doing an independent assessment of human rights programs. And there were women in a prison, and every single one of them was there for a morality offense. They're imprisoned for morality offences. And, and there was one of the women who was there had a little girl who was about 3 or 4 running around, and there were 28 women, and they were all, making a fuss of this little thing. And the terrible thing was, I was, there are standards, there are international standards about children in prisons and so on, and to have a child there on her own with no other child to play with, to be socialised, and it was, and can I tell you, I was told that the child was the product of an American GI having had sex with this girl, and her family had rejected her, they prosecuted her, she's in jail with the baby, and I was told that if there was no prospect for that child, if she went out, and I had to tear the page out of my notebook because, to take that child away from the mother meant a hellish prospect for that child, probably trafficked. So it was better for her to be there with all the limitations that has in development and so on.
Suni, the idea of the law as a weapon, does that work for you?
In an ideal world, yes, but I think the work that we've done in India is we find a lot of women don't even know what the law is, they don't even know what their rights are. And when you think about, they'll go to the police and they'll say to the police, this has happened to me, help me, the police will just send them away, And so I think the first responses are, like Helena, yes, the rule of law is there to protect people and it is that social contract, but on the ground in grassroots communities, those women don't know, they're not aware of the new legislation that's around domestic violence or sexual assault.
Not a weapon that most people can access.
No, it's not. It's inaccessible to them.
Okay.
And in those situations, what those women want when they go to the police is a level of protection and a level of safety, and they want, as Helena's written about before, they want that abuse to stop. They want to be taken away from it, and they want that abuse to stop. And in India, what you will find is that if you take women away from those situations, and they're put in government care, as I'm sure Avi knows, that government care is really poor, and it leads to other abuses or going back to a situation because what is the alternative?
On that question of access, though, I'm going to be a bit provocative here, Helena. It's not just women who struggle to access justice, and only yesterday the Law Society report showed, and you say the same in your book, the criminal justice system in Britain is at breaking point. The quote I picked out was that every part of the process is floundering, and it's a drastically reduced access to legal aid. So would you consider reform based with a focus on poverty rather than gender?
Well, listen, you can't disentangle them, and one of the things that I say in the book is that there's a whole business of what we now describe as intersectionality, which is about the multiple layers of disadvantage that some women will experience because of their class, because of their impoverishment, because of their race, because of their belonging to an ethnic minority, because of their being of their sexuality, because of their disability. I mean, more women, disabled women. I've been so shocked about the level of abuse that there is that disabled women experience, often from their carers. I mean, it's absolutely awful. But so to go back to this thing, the legal aid system in this country was a source of pride, and it was about access to justice. But of course, we've had a government that introduced austerity and saw this as being another aspect of welfare, cut it to the bone. The Ministry of Justice had 25% of its budget taken away from it. I mean, just think about that. That was a quarter of its budget, and what they piled it onto were the courts and legal aid. And so there's no legal aid available in family law. There's no legal aid available for immigration issues. There's no legal aid available on prisons issues, and the legal aid on criminal issues has been cut to the bone so that lawyers just can't survive on it. And so that is having an impact on young women coming into the law, because so many of them choose areas which are about people law and not commercial law. And so it's having an impact there, but it's also really working to hugely damage, I think, a system that we should have been proud of. And it is a disgrace what's been taking place around this in Britain, because it's really, really damaged a system that is so important. For me, you see, the rule of law comes even before democracy. You've got to protect law and the independence of the judiciary and access to justice. Those things are actually at the base. They're, if you like, the kind of foundational stones, and then you build up from there. So it's a depressing time for us.
It is. And how does that question pan out in India?
Well, it's not breaking, it's broken. So, it's a big difference. The criminal justice system is...
I suppose the question that I want to focus on is, you've campaigned and written and spoken around gender. Is it worthwhile just refocusing on people who are excluded in general?
We need to reform, of course, the criminal justice system overall. But it has to focus, it has to start on what it focuses on, because resources are limited, what the state, how it deals with. So it has to start with people who are marginalized first, if you really want to focus.
The most basic of human rights.
The most basic of human rights, but also what is the police's interaction with those marginalized communities, women being the largest of them. Is it around the country, or is it only in metropolitan areas, etc. And very absolutely true, you cannot have a democratic society. You can have elections, but you can't have a democratic society without a rule of law, which ensures there's justice or some semblance of justice being done. So we need reforms in every part, not just in the statutory law, which is what Nirbhaya, post-reforms focused on, but in investigations, in police accountability, in judicial accountability, in allowing access to justice, in ensuring that there is victim compensation, which has a lot to do.
We could have you here. It would be wonderful.
Let's import you.
Import you.
Thank you.
I'm going to ask one more question of the panel, and then I'd like to come to you for questions. But I want to know, we talked about quotas and we talked about the need for female judges, but what evidence is there that greater equality at the top actually helps victims, female victims and people who are excluded, that it helps their passage to justice?
Well, the place that I look to is Canada, because for far longer than anywhere else, they actually did end up, one way or another, whether it was positive or not, I'm not really sure, but at the same time that they created a Charter of Rights, there was a sort of sense that their courts should be reflecting the world out there. And they ended up with a Supreme Court that was, and the Chief Justice was actually, I say this proudly, was a Scotswoman who had emigrated to Canada, she was a real powerhouse, and I think was very influential in making sure that more women came onto that court. And so you ended up with 3 or 4 women. You always have a big proportion of that court.
But what evidence is that it trickles
let me tell
down?
you,
Because
well,
quite often
they
when
changed
people
the
say
law.
trickle down, nothing trickles down.
They changed the law on domestic violence, on the whole business of rape. They, for example, when you say I introduced battered women's syndrome, I mean, we tend not to use that sort of language anymore in relation to it, but it was about PTSD, the suffering and the damage that it does to women's disempowerment to be abused over a long period of time. And sometimes it's not even physical, it's that coercive, controlling behavior that absolutely kind of creates a psychological freezing for women. And that all came to me from Canada and from knowing those Supreme Court judges, because we would meet and we would talk about this stuff, and they changed the law in Canada, and then I introduced it here by making the arguments and drawing upon the case law from the Supreme Court of Canada. So I feel very much that good women, and it has to be women who understand the agenda. There's plenty of women. I've been in the profession now for 40 odd years. There are plenty of women who can do well in all walks of life, and they learn to play the game the male way. We are educated to approach law with that male mindset, and sometimes you have to challenge your own mindset. And the women who've succeeded in it will say to me, I don't know what you're talking about. I've never had any of those problems in all my career, in the law. And I say, lucky you, that's fantastic and good on you, but it's not like that for everybody. And you've got to recognise that people can swallow that pill, and we've got to have much more reflective practice is what I call it.
Reflective practice.
Think more about how you're...
a critical mass. You can't just have one amazing. You know,
Yeah, and you have to have a gang of folk who kind of recognise the ways in which these things operate. But I've seen women making big differences, and the FGM, the female genital mutilation issue in this country, that it could be a basis for getting asylum. It was a woman judge in the Court of Appeal who struggled against the men, and we did a minority judgment and went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court then took up her position. So having good women in senior positions is important, but they have to be women who reckon with the lives that women lead.
Anything to add to that from the rest of the panel?
I would agree with that. I think, and I think for me it stems back to something that you said at the Jaipur festival last year, which was about gender equality. It's not just about women being on board, but it's also about men being on board with it as well. So it's about men supporting women that are in those positions, and being there to engage in those debates, because gender equality isn't just about women getting on board to push that forward. It's also about men, and certainly in my area of policing, there's been some incredible male officers that are really driving that agenda forward about combating gender-based violence.
And actually, you commented that some of the women are quite hostile to it.
And some of the women are hostile to it purely because combating gender-based violence, as Avi was saying, that all the sexual assault cases go to particular individuals, and those particular individuals are women, and the female officers go, there's more to me than just doing these cases. I want to be able to do the
women barristers say that too.
Did you want to add to this?
Yeah, I mean, definitely you need, particularly in an Indian context, intersectionality with caste and economic, the lowest strata of economic. So you need those intersectionalities, because you can't just have, for example, in Indian context, upper caste women being in the Supreme Court. That will have a whole set of problems. But it is, I think, to what Sunita was saying, also requires a level of discourse which recognizes, what you were saying also, that there are issues with the law being equal.
May I ask, for example, how many of your legal colleagues are lower caste?
Not enough. The judiciary is extremely upper caste. We've just had we have 3 women, but 1 Dalit in the Supreme Court. Judges are very low, and people, know each other's caste. So it's actually the judiciary, the judicial profession has a very low representation.
I think that's
in
worldwide.
terms of caste.
It's a posh person's game.
And it has historically. I mean, I'm still known as a first-generational lawyer because nobody ever before in my family was a lawyer, and this is a thing. You've done quite well for yourself being a first-generational lawyer. So and so for example, there was a newspaper report in May which said Supreme Court judges will not hire women staff because of what happened in the case against the Chief Justice, or the lack of a case against the Chief Justice. That kind of report should generate outrage.
It should generate
and it
outrage.
didn't.
Absolutely.
Well, it's a bit like that guy Mike Pence, who's the vice president of the United States. He said, I will never be in a room on my own with a woman.
Who wants to be?
I thought, what does he imagine? What does he think Angela Merkel's going to do to him?
I wish she would. Any questions from the floor, please? Yes, the gentleman in the yellow puffer.
Thank you for the great discussion. But I think that there is an inherent bias here as well, because 40% of the victims of domestic violence in this very country are men.
40.
How many?
40%? No.
Office of National Statistics.
No.
I have checked my numbers.
No.
On top of it,
But to let him finish.
On top of it, 33% of all of those sexual violence cases are registered against the current or the ex-partners, whosoever it is. Okay, and one of the reasons why that is done is to get access to the criminal legal aid. When that is invoked, then you can sort out all the family problems. And for India, 498A, I mean, I don't have to talk about it. And in India, the thing is that men are not considered as a victim of domestic violence because the statute says that it's prevention of women from domestic violence, 2005. Am I right, Mr. Avi? I mean, it cannot be. I mean, you
Just in that part,
yeah.
nothing else.
Yes, and 498A has been abused, and it has, if you want to see a documentary on it, there is a Martyrs of Marriages. People have committed suicide just because they were implicated of this very statute, which is non-compoundable, non-bailable, and it completely goes against the fundamental human rights.
So false allegations in order to access legal aid.
Exactly.
Who would like to respond to this?
Could you just respond if you really want to drive
take a
towards
crack at it.
equality on both countries and every part of the world? Because it's not about men versus women. Everybody is connected. If a son gets accused of false
Okay,
sexual...
I think we've got the idea of the question.
Just
So
let
you want to let the
me
panel take a moment to
Let me
respond.
complete.
Do you want
The mother has committed suicide.
Let me just deal with the business about the legal aid. When legal aid was cut to the bone, it was taken away from family law matters. And then the argument was made very powerfully that in matters where there was evidence of domestic violence, that legal aid should be available to go before the courts, particularly because of there's now a general understanding, which was never around in the past, that children brought up in households where there's domestic violence breathe that in, and it affects their development, and so therefore they are being harmed by the violence that is being experienced by a parent. So it was agreed, and I'm in Parliament and in the House of Lords, and so it was agreed that legal aid would be available where it could be shown that there was a history of domestic violence. And let me tell you, getting that legal aid is very difficult indeed. And I really want people to know that. It is really difficult. Just speak to any family law practitioner. You really have to have real evidence.
Can you
can't
actually
just
pocket from it? Can you pocket any cash at all?
And you certainly can't pocket any money from it. No.
Okay.
Can I just respond very quickly? Because
Yes,
this
and then
yeah.
you in the
Yeah,
round.
firstly, that there is no dowry demands and violence related to it in India, and it's not widespread and systematic. It's complete poppycock. It's
Widely
nonsense.
reported, though. It gets media coverage.
Right, there is, of course. Now, the question here is that there are false allegations because in the end, all these cases get settled because the entire system drives women to settle it from the police that they first reported to mediators in the courts, to the courts themselves as saying, settle it up, go your own separate ways. There's immense pressure, having represented people in this process, there's immense pressure to settle throughout the procedure. And just in terms of false allegations, I could possibly count on my one hand the number of false persecution cases which have been filed subsequent to a 498A case.
Thank you. No, sorry. Now the man with the brown jacket, and then, excuse me, you've had your go, and then you.
Yeah.
So
Do you believe that the law needs to update its definition of words like harassment and consent, now more so in the age of Me Too and digital social media? A lot of times I feel that consent is defined a lot from the potential offender's point of view rather than from the victim's point of view, and that's why whenever a woman comes out with a story, or even a man for that matter, a lot of people say or believe that no, we think you consented, or we think that you were not harassed. And I always ask, who gets to define these words? I look at Sexual Offences Act 2003, Section 74. It says that the prosecution will have to establish whether there was lack of consent. But then the most important point is, how do we define consent? Does the law not need to be clear about that?
Defining consent. And can you keep your hand up, please? And we'll collect a few questions. There's one here, and there's a couple of questions here. So maybe we'll get a few questions in, and you can take. So there's the definition of consent. Yes.
My question is to Helena Kennedy. In light of the Me Too movement, have you seen in the last few years whether there have been any changes to the laws in the UK?
Well,
Can we just gather a couple of questions
we're
first?
gathering.
Cluster of questions here.
Okay.
Me Too changes in law.
Roe versus Wade is going to be coming up soon. I noticed that the recent Tory party candidates felt obliged to sort of comment on abortion matters generally. I'd be curious on an Indian perspective on that as well.
So reproduction rights. A few more questions. Yes, please. Just we'll gather in a few more questions, and somebody at the end there.
This is about intersectionality. So we've talked about women's rights, but now certainly in the last few years, there's been a lot more discussion about genders and fluidity. And I just wonder, how does that affect this question of, what is purely women's rights, whereas you might be looking at trans rights, you might be looking at other rights as well.
And how they overlap. And the lady on the end, please.
I think first to the panel, thank you so much for the fascinating discussion. I am a lawyer trained in India and here. My questions are mainly to Avi and probably Sunita. So just about these two horrific rape incidents that captured the public imagination in India, that's apart from all the banal rape cases that happen, whether it's the Nirbhaya case or the Kathua incident. I think what was shocking was the time taken right from the beginning of the trial to the verdict. For Nirbhaya, the incident was December 2012, and I think the final verdict in the Supreme Court was 2017. Asifa was January 2018, and it's only now after transfers to the Pathankot High Court that you have verdicts. So why is there such significant delay where you find that there are other politically motivated cases? Let's talk about Rahul Gandhi and the Chowkidar chore hair thing, right? And the defamation cases, the Supreme Court heard in a matter of weeks. So why is there such a delay? The second is, in both cases, there were juveniles that were defendants and accused. Now, in the Nirbhaya case, unfortunately, the juvenile was still treated as a juvenile, and he got away with 3 years imprisonment, although he was supposed to be the most violent of all the attackers. Now in Asifa, there's yet another juvenile, and there's someone who got an alibi because he was writing an exam in UP. Again, the alibi is being questioned. So I think for a lawyer seeing this, the questions are, have there been any lessons learned from Nirbhaya that will be applied in Asifa? Second, isn't juvenile going to be given the same treatment? 3, there was a judicial committee set up after Nirbhaya, and what recommendations or changes have they made?
I think we're just going to have to stick to 2 of those, but we're getting the general drift.
To ensure justice is not denied or delayed.
Thank you very much. So that one's for you, Avi, and we've also got, I'd like you to respond to definitions of consent, Me Too and where that's led to changes in the law, and the current attack on Roe versus Wade and intersectionality. So do you want to take that question first and then respond to the other areas?
I mean, just very quickly, the Nirbhaya recommendations were mostly implemented with regard to updating what is sexual assault, particularly rape, changing the age of from 16 to 18 with regard to where there is consent or not, and also upping the punishments. Now there's an ordinance which is bringing in the death charge, which me personally I find unfortunate because I'm against the death penalty mostly. So that's an issue. With regard to speed, that's certainly an issue which afflicts the entire judicial system. It's particularly true when survivors as witnesses have to come again and again to court. It becomes a very, very deliberating process, but it has to go, sort of the efficiency is not just in the speed, but in the substantial justice. So that is a balancing thing, and we do require sort of a systematic reform in that respect, which starts with the statement taken by the magistrate, which is required in law for any rape survivor.
In order to get the rest of our things in, I'm going to have to
I'm going to just shut up because I can keep talking about this.
I think you got something there.
Yeah.
Can you respond, please, either of you, to the other areas that were raised, to the definition of consent or Roe versus Wade?
Well, let me first of all deal with the definition of consent. The myths that live in law, and it's almost everywhere, is that women say no, but they really mean yes, right? And it's part of this business of there's a courtship process in this, and therefore, women, in order to seem as though they're being they're not too easy, pretend that they don't really want it, and then and so this is read by men as therefore somehow giving them permission even when somebody's saying no. Well, I mean, we have to get the message out to our sons and to our now it'll be for me, it'll be with my grandchildren, but you have to get the message out that is not acceptable. You have to keep saying, is this okay? Is this okay? It doesn't mean you have to get a signed form, but it does mean you can be saying to people, is this okay? And It has to be clear. If somebody is drunk, under the influence of drugs or anything like that, they are not going to be able to consent in a way that should be accepted by the courts. And we should be making that clear to everybody. And
Question
also
of education. There's a brilliant
understanding.
infographic about cups of tea.
Let me just tell you, there's a
I was going to mention this. So something that we do as well with the police officers is that we have this conversation with them about consent.
Yeah.
What do the police officers think about what consent is as well? So when somebody comes into a police station and says, this is what's happened to me, and the police go, are you sure you didn't consent to that, particularly when it comes to rape? And in India, the cup of tea, as we know, is really prominent, having a cup of tea everywhere. So this is a wonderful video that you can access on YouTube, that consent is a cup of tea. And it's really simple,
very good.
and
I
it's
urge everyone
sick
to have a quick
men.
look. I mean, it doesn't address the changes in the law that you're looking for, but it's a good start.
I want to, there's something really important
That's
here.
really quick.
Just one thing, which is that sometimes you can consent to one thing. You know, you could be consenting to sexual intercourse, and then somebody says turn over and wants to penetrate you somewhere else. You're entitled to say no. And so this is one of the problems, is that somehow it's assumed that it's a catch-all, that you're saying yes to everything. And that's why it's important to be doing this thing of saying, is this okay? And that saying no can mean to some part of intimacy. And sometimes, too often, women are being subjected to things that they do not want to have happening to them.
Very well said. And to finish, I'm really sorry we're not going to be able to answer everybody's questions, but whoever it was that asked about Roe versus Wade, that is one of the questions. The attack on women's reproductive rights is something that should strike the fear of God into all of us.
Yep,
I would like to turn to my panel and, for one way or another, give us a ray of hope or sunshine or some kind of reason to feel positive about women and justice. Do your best.
I'm going to say to you that I now spend a lot of my time with young people in the universities and in my own practice, and I head up an Institute of Human Rights, and there are lots young men and women, and I tell you this: women and men are forging a different way of being together, and we actually are able to see a different kind of future. So I don't believe it has to be like this. A different discourse is happening, and the energy of our young is going to lead the way. So I am optimistic about where this is going to go.
To the young, Suni.
I endorse that. I mean, one of the things for me that is wonderful about India is its next generation. They are forward-thinking, they're dynamic, they're go-getting, and conversations that I had with young people in Jaipur in January was amazing. Young men saying, you know, we need to be, you know, the bastions of gender equality. We need to be purporting this. So I think the next generation for me is the
young
hope.
people, they've got to save the climate as well. I mean, we're putting a lot on them. Avi, what do you want to add?
You know, I'm glad you warned me to think of something to say which was positive. So I thought about it, and I talked to 16-year-olds in a school, part of a government program about the relationships and gender, etc. And I've got to say, you know, sort of talking to them not just about, well, you know, this sort of thing about family and treating women with respect and is it your sister, but really talking with them about the autonomy of each person, irrespective of gender, and having that conversation and them understanding these are government schools, albeit in Delhi, not in some remote area. So if that's, you know, and that's something which should be part of the curriculum. Much more.
Okay, so the theme is hope for the next generation, but that does not let us oldies off the hook.
No,
huge thanks to Avi Singh, to Sunita Toor, and to Helena Kennedy. Thank you very much. You've been amazing. You're brilliant. Thank you so much.